Welcome to the City Council special meeting this Tuesday evening on January 17th. I now call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Hedges.
Here.
Councilmember Lorraine.
Here.
Councilmember Newsom.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash.
Here.
Thank you. And Mayor Lee.
Here. We are excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to our wonderful clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you'll be called on at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for each specific item. Let's see. We'll begin with one item on the agenda, which will be a study session. And the study session is to look at speed limit setting and program update. We have a presentation from our senior engineer, Bethany Lopez. Take it away, Bethany.
Good evening, Council. My name is Bethany Lopez. I'm a senior engineer overseeing the traffic division in the Public Works Department. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the plan for setting speed limits in the city. We're going to go through why it's important to set speed limits. We'll discuss the California Vehicle Code for setting speed limits, talk about an immediate term plan and a long-term strategy for how to address them, and then get into questions and discussion. So the first question is, why is it important to set speed limits? Setting speed limits and enforcing those is part of establishing a safe roadway system. The safe systems approach is being used to help achieve a safe roadway system. And you'll see this diagram, it's from the FHWA actually. One of the fundamental principles of the safe systems approach that you'll see along the top wording is, sorry, excuse me one moment. Is that fatal and severe injury collisions are unacceptable on our roadway system. A few of the other foundational principles are along the other parts of the outside of this diagram. And those are principles such as human beings being vulnerable, humans making mistakes, lead to the notion that we need redundancy within our approach to roadway safety. And in order for this redundancy to happen, there needs to be a shared responsibility and a shared approach to achieving a safe roadway system that that roadway safety cannot be accomplished all under one group or one umbrella. So what are the elements of a safe systems approach? The first three categories that fall under this I'm going to talk about the first three categories that fall under this approach. They are not specifically public works related, but I do want to talk about what they are. The first one being safe roadway users. So individual users, roadway users must take a personal responsibility, meaning not to be distracted or impaired, as well as to follow roadway rules. Pretty intuitive The second one falls under the umbrella of vehicle manufacturers. Safe vehicles can include safety improvements such as autonomous braking for obstacles or for bikes and pedestrians, as well as safety for vehicle passengers, such as airbags and seatbelts. The third approach has to do with post-crash care and really lends to what happens after a collision has already occurred and how to keep that situation from getting worse, such as having adequate emergency response and incident management. The last two are the primary focus of our public works team. Safe roads is an effort that we're actively working towards in efforts like the general plan update, where our focus on the circulation element has been shifted away from a vehicle-centric roadway network to a multimodal one where the safety of all roadway users is prioritized. We've just started our complete streets plan, which will provide additional detail to our roadway network configuration based on those principles in the general plan that we've worked to identify and modify. We're also working on a local roadway safety plan, which uses data to identify collision trends and makes recommendations for how to increase safety for all roadway users throughout the city. And lastly, our transit-oriented development pedestrian access plan, which was just adopted a few months ago, will help improve access and safety for pedestrians in the vicinity of our transit systems. These efforts all tie directly into this last item, which is safe speeds, the primary discussion topic for this evening. Our efforts the efforts that we just discussed will all help with the goal of designing roadways for the speeds really that we want. So that's one of the first principles of the safe speeds element. And we're hoping to get there with these documents that we're developing. Another part of our goal is to implement implement speed limits that consider all roadway users. And we'll get into this a little bit more this evening when we're talking about our longer term plan. And then ensuring compliance with the speed limits that we have. This is a mechanism that we anticipate needing to be able to utilize both in the short term and in the longer term as we work towards our goals of safer streets throughout the city. So in order for us to be able to utilize enforcement, however, we need to make sure that those speed limits that we have posted out there align with state laws, and we'll get into a little bit of the California Vehicle Code. So the laws and requirements for setting speed limits are the California Vehicle Code, also known as the CVC or the Vehicle Code, contains statutes related to owning, operating, and registering vehicles and bikes, for that matter, on public roads in California. The California Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, also known as the California MUTCD, contains standards for traffic signs, roadway markings, and traffic signals in California. This version has been adopted from the Federal Highway Administration's version of the federal MUTCD that was adopted in 2009. The most recent revision to the California MUTCD was in March of 2021. Together, these two documents establish the policy for establishing speed limits. The CVC defines locations and scenarios where speed limits are applied and also identifies where and how local agencies can apply their own speed limits. The California MUTCD provides a more in-depth information about the specifics of how speed limits within local agencies can be established. So I wanted to talk briefly about some of the themes for setting speed limits, and we're going to get into some definitions as well. So these are primarily themes where statutory speed limits do not apply, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But what we do see in the California Vehicle Code and also in the California MUTCD is these notions that ensuring speeds are set in a way that do not create violators of the majority of drivers. And also that speeds should be set near what drivers consider are reasonable and prudent. So these all tie into this idea of the 85th percentile, another term and definition that we'll get into in just a moment. But again, I'll tie back to that when we get to that slide. We'll be able to demonstrate sort of how these themes apply when we're looking at the 85th percentile speed. Some other terminology we're going to look at is the prima facie. So prima facie speed limits are, like it says here, just default speed limits. And then there's also statutory prima facie speed limits. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as well. But these are essentially specific speed limits that we can use under specific conditions. And so you'll see these, you'll be familiar with these. These are your 25 miles per hour in school zones, 25 mile per hour in business districts, 15 miles per hour in alleyways. So these are, again, these are called statutory speed limits, and they're specific locations or specific speeds defined under specific conditions.
Through the chair, Bethany, I'm sorry, before we go too much farther, could you maybe go one more slide back and just, I wanted to, drivers reasonable and prudent. Thank you.
So we'll get into the 85th percentile speed now and what that is. So the 85th percentile speed is the speed at which 85% of vehicles are traveling at or below. So in this diagram to the right, you'll see the notation of what the 85th, or excuse me, where the 85th percentile speed is. And again, that's the speed that 85% of the vehicles are traveling at that speed or below that speed. This is also called the prevailing or the critical speed. And when we're utilizing the 85th percentile or trying to determine the 85th percentile on a roadway, we collect it using a calibrated radar. So this is a slightly different methodology than some of us may be familiar with, where we use pneumatic tubes to determine the speed on a roadway when we're taking a speed survey. When we're using calibrated radar, we must use, like it says, a radar device, and we must measure the speed of free flow traffic. So generally, we're accounting for about 1 hour's worth of time or 100 vehicles in this radar speed survey. In this, we're also not allowed to take speeds of platooned vehicles. So what that means is that if you have one vehicle that's leading and a bunch of vehicles that are behind it, those vehicles that are behind it can't necessarily be accounted for because they're not traveling at a free flow speed, if you will. So you'd need to take the front vehicle and then take successive vehicles that are not in that platoon. So the next portion of this is about what the California Vehicle Code specifically requires for setting speed limits. And so going back to those statutory speed limits that we were talking about, there's actually quite a few of these. These are just a few examples. We have 15 mile per hour speed limits over railroad crossings, on hills in certain locations. In alleys, like I had mentioned, 25 miles per hour in business or residence districts, school zones, and senior zones. And then statutory prima facie speed limits for all other areas is 55 miles per hour on undivided highways or 65 miles per hour everywhere else. So again, default speed limits are these that are defined here in the beginning part of this, these lower ones, 15 and 25. And there's a few other provisions for things like 20 miles per hour in business activity districts or 15 miles per hour in school zones, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But again, everywhere else, the statutory speed limit is 55 miles per hour or 65 on divided highways. So the however, lower prima facie speed limits can be established with the use of an engineering and traffic survey. That's what that ETS is when it's adopted by ordinance. And so I'm going to talk about what an engineering and traffic survey is. So for a specific roadway segment, an engineering and traffic survey includes the prevailing speed. So going back to that 85th percentile speed, it must include that. It also includes collision records and roadway and traffic conditions. And I put in here quotes, not readily apparent to the driver. That's something that's defined very specifically in both the MUTCD and in the CVC, that conditions not readily apparent to the driver. Like I said, it generally primarily includes like a pattern of collision history. The California MUTCD outlines the requirements for what the posted speed limit, for what for what posted speed limit to recommend based on that prevailing speed. And like I says here, that's usually, the recommendation is usually to round it to the nearest 5 mile per hour of the prevailing speed. So the nearest 5 mile from that, 5 miles per hour from that 85th percentile speed that we collect. And the engineering and traffic survey is also needing to be approved by a licensed engineer. So getting into the immediate and long-term plan to update speed limits. So the immediate term plan is to identify top roadway segments in the city where there's a desire to enforce roadway speeds. We would need to adopt an ordinance to establish the speeds on these roadways that would be based on the engineering and traffic survey findings. And the timeline to be able to enforce on these roadway segments would be about 2 months following the ordinance adoption. So what are the proposed speed limits on these roadways? From here, I'm going to talk about this. Sorry for I have the arrows on here. It's going to be a little bit much to put in just in a note here. So I'll explain that. So for we have the roadway, the segment location, so the extents of it, where it's from and where it's to, the existing speed limit that was posted out there, the 85th percentile speed that we collected, that prevailing speed survey, the proposed speed limit. In this proposed speed limit column, you'll also see the arrow, and the arrow represents what it's doing, what that speed is recommended to be at compared to the existing speed limit. So you can see that in 5 of the 7 locations, the speed limit is being proposed to be increased by 5 miles per hour. In 2 of the locations, the speed limit is recommended to stay the same. And then the methodology here at the end, this is going to be, sorry, it's a little bit convoluted, so I apologize in advance. But the methodology has to do with the way that we are allowed to round the speed limit based on that 85th percentile speed. So you can see for Hillsdale, Del Monte to Alameda de las Pulgas, for Kehoe, Norfolk to Roberta, Norfolk, and on Poplar, the 2 arrows indicate that we had an ability to round down one time, and we would, the default speed limit per what I was mentioning before. So for the 36 mile per hour, 85th percentile, the recommendation would be to round down to 35. That would be the baseline recommendation. We have an ability with an engineering and traffic survey to recommend an additional 5 miles per hour lower, but that's as far down as we're allowed to recommend. So for those locations that I was just mentioning where these double arrows are, this is the lowest speed that we can recommend based on the 85th percentile analysis. The other locations, J. Hart Clinton, Kehoe, for those ones, we would have had to round to the nearest 5 miles per hour, like I was mentioning. We would have needed to round up. So for J. Hart Clinton, we would have needed to round that to 55 miles per hour or to 35 miles per hour. However, the CVC and the California MTCD allows us to round down where certain engineering findings are made, again, through that engineering and traffic survey. And then for Hillsdale Boulevard from 31st to Del Monte, again, we were able to round down. We were not able to make the findings that that would allow us to round down this location one more time. So that one is the default, rounding down to 30 miles per hour. So the long-term plan to update speed limits is fairly comprehensive. So what we would like to do is identify all locations where these statutory prima facie speed limits apply. So again, looking at the city comprehensively and trying to identify where, so we've already done the effort to identify where these will apply near school zones, and I'll talk about that in a moment, where they can apply near senior centers, business activity districts, business districts, local roadways, certain roadways that are less than a certain width. So anywhere that we have the ability to identify these lowered statutory speed limits, we want to go ahead and do that. So from there, we also want to take a look at AB 43 and AB 1938 changes that were made. And some of these also lend to the statutory prima facie speed limits that I was just mentioning. And I'll talk about these assembly bills in more detail in just a moment. With those, we do want to make some ties to our complete streets plans and our local roadway safety plans. There's elements of these assembly bills that allow us to look at safety corridors or safety in the vicinity of bikes and peds that we think that these other plans that we're currently working on will help lend to as we work to identify this full, more comprehensive plan. All right. And then finally, we want to be able to, sorry, not finally, we want to be able to complete engineering and traffic surveys for all other locations. So again, because we want to be able to set speed limits lower than 65 or 55 miles per hour, like we had discussed earlier, that statutory speed limit where we don't have where we would need an engineering and traffic survey. Anywhere else that we can't apply these statutory prima facie speed limits, we'll need to do engineering and traffic surveys on so that we can identify lower speeds than 65 and 55. And so that would also include an analysis of these 7 locations that we looked at just earlier. And then that would finally culminate in adoption of a new ordinance for speed limits citywide. So getting into Assembly Bills 38 and 1938, 43 and 1938, there were a few changes that were made that went into effect, not necessarily immediately, but at the beginning of the following year that they were adopted. And there's a few changes that were made that are not yet applicable. So just a quick summary of some of these. So there's an allowance for bike and ped safety and engineering and traffic surveys. That was something that we went ahead and took into account when we did our analysis. So other changes are that it allows for expanded speed limit considerations of 15 miles per hour and 20 miles per hour. And so previously, prior to AB 43, prior to AB 43, we were only allowed to set speed limits as low as 25 miles per hour. And so AB 43 modified that and allowed us to also implement 15 and 20 miles per hour in certain locations. So that would be either based on engineering and traffic surveys, or again, based on some of these statutory prima facie speed limits. It also expands lower speed limits in this newly created definition of business activity district, similar to the allowance for school zones. And so this is similar to a business district, but it specifies it a little bit differently. And there's certain criteria that need to be met for us to be able to establish speeds per a business activity district. It also allows the speeds to remain valid for greater lengths of time where certain findings are made, and allows for the retention of currently adopted or immediately prior adopted speed limits where certain findings are made for that. For those last 2 bullets, we have identified that there's technical deficiencies with the prior engineering and traffic surveys that were completed, or for some of those locations that none had been done for those locations at all. And as such, we're not able to utilize those these 2 sections, these last 2 bullet points, to extend or retain the prior engineering and traffic surveys. The last one, the changes applicable in June 2024 relate to California Vehicle Code that I had mentioned, these safety corridors or high generating bike and ped facilities. So this allows for an additional 5 mile per hour down zoning on top of the engineering and traffic survey findings. So we discussed that allowance for the rounding previously, that you can round. So if it's like 36, you can round down to 30 by default, and then you can round down again, and that would be your engineering and traffic survey finding. This would allow you to round down one more time on top of that. However, there's an allowance, a modification made through Assembly Bill 1938 that limits that lowering to no more than 12.4 miles per hour of the 85th percentile speed. So, like I was mentioning, there's a desire to potentially tie these safety improvements on these safety corridors to the local roadway safety plan, where we're trying to identify, safety related issues throughout the city. And this may be a mechanism by which we can help address those safety challenges. So as I was mentioning, I wanted to talk about the school zone speed limit project that we're currently working on. The resolution was adopted in December of 2021 to implement school zone speed limits. And it was recommended to adopt the school zone speed limits for all schools throughout the city. What this will do is establish 15 mile per hour speed limits within 500 feet of schools and 25 miles per hour within 500 to 1,000 feet of schools. And these are distances that are stipulated in the California Vehicle Code. This will result in lowered speeds on 16 miles of our city roadways during school hours. And 2 of these locations actually do overlap with our priority locations, the Poplar Avenue corridor, as well as the Kehoe corridor. And so what you'll see in this map, I apologize, the text is a little bit small, so you might not be able to read all the school names, but all of the yellow represents all of the 15 mile per hour school zones that we'll be able to implement throughout the city. And then the 25 represents all of the 25 mile per hour speed limits school zones that we'll be able to implement throughout the city. So the timeline for the citywide speed limit update, should council decide to recommend that we move forward with adopting an ordinance for the 7 priority locations, is that next month we would bring back an ordinance for council introduction. In March, we would bring back an ordinance for adoption. In spring of this year, we would look to start the background research that's necessary for that long-term plan. So identifying all those locations where the statutory speed limits apply in the city, and then doing the necessary analysis to complete the engineering and traffic surveys where that doesn't apply. And then we would bring back a citywide ordinance in winter of next year. This does align somewhat with our school zone speed limit implementation, so I wanted to talk about that briefly. So phase 1 of this school zone speed limits, which was all elementary schools, all public elementary schools throughout the city. We started bid on this project, I believe last week or the week prior, and that, the bid opening will be at the end of this month. We're expecting to bring an a contract award to council in March, and complete the construction of that by June 2023. The second and third phases, we have determined that we can likely combine those 2 to try to expedite getting those done. And we want to start those, the design for those next month. We expect to be able to bid that project out this fall and begin the construction of it next winter. So tonight we're asking for council feedback about the recommendation for staff to proceed with implementing the speed limit changes at the priority locations, about the continuation of the long-term safety strategy development and implementation, and then also discussion and questions.
Thank you, Bethany. Hats off to you for distilling very complicated information in a very efficient and understandable way. We can start with questions from council, or we can go straight to public comment. Does council have a preference?
I have a longer arm, so I requested those last meeting.
Councilmember Hedges requested that we go to public comment first, and sounds like there's agreement. So we can open public comment.
Our first speaker in house will be Kevin Simpson. Go ahead.
Thanks, Council. Hello, Happy New Year. Although I think I saw you on the 3rd or the 4th. 2 weeks ago, when we had our city council meeting, I had planned to come here to talk about speed on Humboldt. And so it was really opportune that I see this here today. I appreciate all the work the city staff has put into this, but I have to tell you, to sit here and see that we're recommending raising speed limits on San Mateo city streets beggars belief, and we may be beggars my belief, and maybe our hands are tied and that's all we can do. I can't think of an argument for raising speed limits anywhere in this city, and I can think of a lot of arguments for lowering speed limits net or lowering speed net throughout the city. In the last 5 weeks, I've been woken up or disturbed at 11:30 or 12 o'clock at night to run down to the corner of 2nd and Humboldt near where I live due to a horrific crash at a 4-way stop there. The last one, the gentleman came down my street so loud that I actually stood up before the crash. He came down so loud and fast, went around two cars at that four-way stop intersection, managed to miss both of them, plowed up onto the sidewalk on the west side of the street where I frequently walk my dogs, snapped off a city sign at its base, took out 20 feet of fencing in front of the corner house, knocked down a stockade fence in the second house on the street, knocked their car 30 feet up diagonally across their driveway, totaled his own car, and nearly got impaled by a steel rod that went through his windshield. As I and another resident tried to help him pick glass out of his hands, he attempted to flee on foot. We don't have enough enforcement of speed in our city, and Humboldt is a prime example of it. People treat it like a racetrack. And now that the no parking on the left side, which I fought for, is in effect, people think it's wide open. You can go as fast as you want through there. I've been begging, every time I see a police officer out front, I beg them for more enforcement on Humboldt. I spoke to the officers that night at that accident. I begged them for more enforcement on Humboldt. Whatever we do, let's not take speed as just kind of a nuisance. We all think of it as kind of a light offense. It's a horrible killing offense, and it's going to take out some people on Humboldt. I've had to pick up the bodies of my neighbors' dogs, and I hope I'm not out there picking up the bodies of their children anytime soon. So whatever you can do to get the net speeds down in our city, throughout the city, I urge you to do. And if we have to go through this painful process to get there by actually raising speed limits on 5 streets, let's do it. But if there's any way we can go the other direction and start lowering speed limits, let's do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 2 other speakers in the meeting room. We have 9 hands raised on the Zoom call. If you intend to speak, please raise your hand now on the Zoom call so we can get a final count. The next speaker is Lauren Fitzgerald, followed by Ignacio.
Good evening, Council. I would very, very strongly urge you not to raise speed limits tonight. Not only is this an ineffective practice, but it can actually be really dangerous for our city. We've all heard plenty of close calls and accidents where someone has gotten hurt. I know just opening Nextdoor for 2 seconds, you hear about people being hit by cars. A lot of the proposed areas where we're proposing to raise limits are near school zones. And as a student, that concerns me. I'm concerned for my cousins, my neighbors who walk to school. And frankly, this is not only ineffective, but it's unsafe. And raising speed limits is completely counterintuitive, as you would imagine. Raising limits doesn't make cars go slower. It allows reckless drivers to continue to be reckless. So if you want to protect your constituents, I would highly recommend that you lower limits. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ignacio.
Good evening. I'm also here to support lowering speed limits in the city. I used to walk to school along Kehoe and Norfolk, and I might even bike down those streets, but sometimes it's awfully scary when there's cars speeding by. My sister still walks to school, and I see no reason why we should raise limits. I love what we did on, I believe, 31st and Hillsdale, where we added speed bumps. When I drive along those, I'm forced to slow down. And I think we should look into implementing that across the city, especially near schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are moving to the remote attendees. We have 10 speakers. The first speaker will be Max Montner, and the last speaker will be Jordan Grimes. Thank you so much, Max. Please go ahead.
Hi there, it's Max Montner. I'm a member of Move San Mateo, and I live on or off of Poplar. I was really appreciative of the bike lanes going in on Poplar and Humboldt, and recognized that one of the segments being discussed today is directly between San Mateo High School and the elementary school near Delaware. And there's a pedestrian crossing that is utilized by both students from both schools. So I'm very surprised to see the proposal to comply with the state law is something we've got to do, but I'd urge the council to explore our options as far as perhaps rerunning the survey now that the bike lanes are in, and looking at our options to modify the road design in adjacency to our schools, specifically Hillsdale and San Mateo High School, which are two of the segments that I'm surprised to see us looking to increase the speed limits. So urge the council to explore our options here in any way that can avoid raising the speed limits in adjacency to our schools. Thanks.
Thank you. The next speaker is Sean Loxton, followed by Yiming Lu. Go ahead, Sean.
Thank you. Good evening, City Council. My name is Sean Laxon. I'm a member of Move San Mateo. I'm also speaking on behalf of Move San Mateo, our active transportation advocacy group. So we're here to urge the council to vote no on the proposed speed limits, knowing especially that several of these proposed segments run near 3 schools: San Mateo High School, Hillsdale High School, and Bayside Academy. The city has already commissioned a study back in 2021 and approved to slow down streets that run next to the schools, and has already approved funding for schools that qualify for this program. Instead, within a faster timeline, the city is proposing to raise those speed limits up to 30 miles per hour. According to the National Traffic Safety Board, if a car hits a pedestrian going at 30 miles per hour, there's a 45% chance of a fatality. So that's basically a coin flip that we're now enabling our drivers to move at in order to hit pedestrians by accident. That's really not okay. Additionally, the city wants to also rely on the police department to enforce the new speed limits. As other commenters have mentioned, this is an unwise use of our resources, as our police department is spread thin already as it is, responding to many types of emergencies, and it's unrealistic to expect police to be present on these segments and enforce the new traffic speeds 24/7. A better use of funds instead would be to design traffic calming measures along these segments, encourage drivers to drive slower in a way that they can naturally understand that they will need to drive slower in order to do so, and not rely on police enforcement to enforce these traffic speeds. Finally, I also urge the City Council to work with the State Assembly to continue to revamp old and confusing and outdated vehicle codes that have led to this proposed increase. So thank you for your time, City staff and City Council. I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Yiming Lu, followed by Rayan Motoshimi.
Good evening, council. I oppose the new speed changes. I'm a high school senior that bikes to school, so this would really affect me. And I don't see how the higher speed limits would lead to better outcomes for cyclists like me and pedestrians. What Sean said, it's been proven time and time again that faster speeds cause more fatalities. And you've mentioned that a lot of the locations are near schools. Poplar's near San Mateo High and Hillsdale's near Hillsdale High. I don't see how you can have both slower and faster speed limits at the same time. You said that the construction would be finished in June, but you're also going to implement these faster speed limits within 2 months and enforce them in May. I think it's going to be confusing to start enforcement of faster speeds in May and then have the slow speeds implemented in June. It just makes the speed limits seem more arbitrary and just based on a whim rather than, objective. And what Sean said, ticketing and enforcement is more of a reactive choice. I think we should be pushing a more proactive choice of building better infrastructure and encouraging drivers to just slow down because they want to, instead of because they're scared of the police. And I think the city's efforts could be better used on quick build pilot projects that changes the behaviors of drivers using infrastructure rather than through police. Thank you, and I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ryan Motoshimi, followed by Ron Snow. Go ahead, Ryan.
Good evening, City Council, Honorable Mayor Lee. Thank you very much for your time on this matter. I'll start out with a couple of questions. And one question is, when was the most recent engineering and traffic survey conducted? I would contend that if an engineering and traffic survey were conducted now and done to omit and make sure there were no technical deficiencies. My question would be whether it would be possible to then make use of vehicle code 22358.8, which allows a local authority to make findings that say that the engineering and traffic survey still is recommending a speed that is higher than is reasonable or safe, and would then allow for the retention of the currently adopted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. That would be, of course, apply only to roadway segments that had an engineering and traffic survey, is my understanding. But if staff could, at the appropriate time, I would hope that this would be part of the council's discussion of whether there isn't a route to redo engineering and traffic surveys and then make use of that specific vehicle code that allows for the retention of adopted speed limits under certain circumstances. And that's part of existing vehicle code. I'm not sure why it also needs to be part of MUTCD if vehicle code itself in current statute lists that. The other question I have is, I guess, more a philosophical question, and that's why are we doing a study session on speed limits when I'm not positive, at least in the time that I've been following things, I'm not sure if we had a study session on specific traffic calming opportunities on these corridors and whether speed cushions are possible, what the expected budget value and timeline for implementation of those strategies could be. I understand this call for addressing speed, and I'm wondering why we're not trying to apply a slow at first approach so that we can first slow down vehicle speeds, and then as 85th percentile speeds reduce, we can then conduct the necessary engineering and traffic surveys and have an easier time lowering our speed limits pursuant to state law. I support this slow at first approach, even if it's more resource intensive, and I think that that's good. A good incentive for the council to understand in their policy, in the policy setting workshop that will be upcoming. How much do you want to encourage traffic calming so that the calls of residents across the city to really slow down our streets are heard? I don't think we're doing that yet, and I think we really need to move forward on that so we don't come up with positions here where on our high priority corridors where we're trying to address vehicle speeds, we're not able to implement traffic calming because of lack of resources. So please encourage you to slow the speeds and then lower the speed limits. Do not raise the speed limits. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Ryan.
Ryan. Next speaker is Ron Snow. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for letting me address the council here. I think there's some misguided thinking here in the sense that to raise speed limits, it seems like from the materials that part of that was due to be able to lower them in the future. I think it's misguided to think that the 85% tile is a trump card. If you look at the other areas in the same vehicle code and MUTCDs, you'll notice that the number of homes is a factor. The number of driveways is a factor. School zones and safe routes to schools are also a factor. A big one is accident rates. I just heard several people talking about accidents. Accident rates is a factor. So 85 percentile is just one of the measurements that need to be considered. All these other things, and most of these areas that are being recommended are residential areas with lots of homes. It just should not be a case where you're raising the speed limit in these areas. In all cases, even if an 85 percentile measurement is taken and the considerations for housing and driveways and accidents is considered, the city council has the final word in this and can, through passing a resolution, lower the speed limits to any value they want to. So the speed limit can be lowered even against an 85 percentile measurement. I think it gets back to what the prior speaker was talking about. What is the goal? Is it speed limits? Or is the goal to have safer streets, to lower accidents, to reduce injuries and deaths? As mentioned by others, An increase of 5 miles an hour greatly increases the seriousness of an injury. Enforcement is a fiction. All engineering sources agree that the only way to effectively reduce speed is by design. Many of these roadways appear, if you made the roadways appear to be slower, then speeds would be reduced. Most of the roads being recommended for higher speeds should instead define the travel lane to be a narrower lane, define a better bike path, and you could further reduce these things by using other calming techniques that are promoted, such as greenery and furniture and reduced intersection widths. So it just seems totally unreasonable to not consider all the other things that go into setting a speed and having safer schools and safer roadways for the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Heather Wolnick, followed by M.
Hello, thank you for taking up this issue. My name is Heather Wolnick. I'm a resident here in San Mateo, and I also work for the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. And one of our recommendations to all cities is to slow it first. By design, the 85th percentile rule was not set to keep our streets safe. Even in the staff presentation, the stated goal is to make the majority of drivers not break the law. That's not a safety goal. And with current designs of cars, for example, my car is smooth and quiet. And even when I consciously try, it's hard for me to go 25 miles an hour in some places because that's how the technology has advanced. We can't expect drivers to slow down unless we make physical changes on our roads. We also, I didn't hear anything about a commitment to actually enforce this. It just allows us to enforce it. But are we then targeting these areas? And even if we do, that enforcement can't be done 24/7. We're still going to get the speeders, and it's also going to just push up that 85th percentile every single time we increase the speed limit. People will feel that it's safe to go faster because a lot of people view speed limits that way, that that's the safe speed rather than just the speed that everyone else is going. So I strongly, strongly urge this council to not increase the speed limits and explore all options for not doing so. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is M, followed by Ted McKinnon.
Hi, this is M, aka Mike Swire. Sorry about that. Hello, Mayor Lee and honorable members of the council. Thanks for tonight's discussion on how to prevent speeding and reduce traffic fatalities in San Mateo. And thanks to the staff for their efforts. I'm the parent of 2 teens at San Mateo High School, and I'm a member of Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. And over the past few years, I've been working with the school, the high school district, and the city in reducing the number of crashes in the area and making it easier and safer for kids to bike and walk to school instead of driving. I rise in vehement opposition to the proposal to raise speed limits on various streets in town. This decision could cost lives, decrease the quality of life for residents, lower property values, discourage people from walking and biking, and increase the number of cars on the road. As I'm sure you are aware, many people look to the speed limit as a guide for their speed. If we increase the speed limit, people will go faster. If people go faster, they're more likely to crash. Speed is indeed the #1 driver-related cause of crashes. When drivers crash at higher speeds, they're exponentially more likely to kill residents on foot or bike or even in the car. We talk about reducing auto traffic in San Mateo and increasing the number of people who get around on foot or bike. Yet the primary reason the parents don't let their kids bike to school or walk to a friend's house is fear that they will not make it home safely. Some are brave enough to walk or bike, but higher vehicle speeds make it an unpleasant experience. My understanding is that the city has failed to enforce speed limits on most streets for some time due to the lack of speed surveys. If enforcement is such a strong tool, however, why have we waited so long to do the surveys and had no enforcement in the interim? The fact is that enforcement is largely ineffective in producing long-term reductions in speeding. With 5 traffic officers across a city of 100,000, it's impossible for SMPD to use speeding tickets as a credible deterrent to speeding. Most speeders noted the chances of getting caught while speeding are perhaps 1 in 10,000. Many people do use speed limits as their guide, i.e. the 85th percentile. If we raise speed limits, we are telling them it's okay to go faster. Do we really want to raise vehicle speeds for 85% of drivers so that we might have the opportunity to write tickets for the 15% who speed? This seems counterproductive. The proposal includes 50-mile-an-hour speed limits on J. Hart Clinton Drive. This road is adjacent to one of the poorest neighborhoods in town. Would we ever consider 50-mile-per-hour speeds in San Mateo Park or Beresford? I don't think so. Studies have shown that the victims of traffic violence are often minorities and those with lower income. These are the people that can't afford the $45,000 a year average price for a new car. The staff packet does not mention current crash or fatality rates on these streets, nor does it mention pedestrian cyclist volumes. These are both mitigating factors that can be used to thwart the 85th percentile methodology. I'm surprised that this is on the agenda and could potentially be implemented within 2 months, given that we have still yet to implement one change related to the 2021 Slow Streets Near Schools policy approved by council. I hope this is coming back and will be done soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ted McKinnon, followed by Bree.
Good evening. Thank you. I'd like to echo the comments of the previous speakers and speak specifically to the conditions on Hillsdale Boulevard. In addition to Hillsdale High being nearby, that section of Hillsdale where you're intending on, where the proposed 30-mile-an-hour speed limit is very steep and winding, and the properties are necessarily terraced, and that's going to create a big visibility problem for residents backing out of their cars, out of their driveways. So I think it's clear that raising the speed limit is going to encourage drivers to go faster than they already are and create dangerous conditions for those residents. In addition to pedestrians crossing at Del Monte, I walk my dog off across Hillsdale there just about every night, and there's lots of discourteous drivers who they don't necessarily run the stop sign, but they're anxious and they don't observe the pedestrian right away. So I think that this just encourages that bad behavior, and I please urge the council to vote down this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bree, excuse me, followed by Jordan Grimes.
Thank you. Thank you to city staff for the presentation, and city council for allowing us to publicly comment. I'm a mom of young kids who walks, bikes, and scooters with my children throughout the San Mateo, and just the idea of raising speed limits is terrifying. Drivers are already driving 10 to 15 miles above the speed limits, and it just kind of feels like by increasing these speed limits, we're validating these bad drivers and their choices and just kind of conforming to their behaviors versus making the smart move, which would be taking the time to hopefully change the way our streets are designed and put in some traffic calming measures so that we or change the way the road is built to reduce speeds. As others have stated, these roads that are the proposed speed limit increases are next to many schools, which are thousands of students, and it's just crazy. I want to give an example of, for every, I just want to state this, for every additional 5 to 10 miles per hour above the speed limit or even faster, drivers' peripheral vision is decreased and the reaction time is decreased and their ability to stop is decreased. So for an example, today my son and I were on a sidewalk, and for some reason he's trying to bike with one hand. He's a little guy, and an Amazon driver was driving probably only 15 miles per hour, but he saw my son kind of swerving on the sidewalk. And because he was driving slower and not above the speed limit, he was able to move over in the road and put more distance between him and my son, even though my son didn't go into the road, and he was driving safely versus some of those drivers that are just speeding through, not looking at anyone around them or what obstructions are in the road. And I'm super grateful for those good drivers that choose not to drive above the speed limits, but they are few and far between. And so I ask you to please vote no on increasing speed limits for the safety of all pedestrians out there and even the drivers. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jordan Grimes, and our last speaker will be Kelly Moran.
Good evening, Council, Honorable Mayor. Respectfully, this really feels like the wrong direction for us to be heading in. It feels like we are going backward instead of forward here. As others have mentioned, faster speeds and speed increases, even what seem like incremental ones, even increases from, 5 mile per hour increases directly result in more and greater harm to cyclists and pedestrians. I'm saying this as a frequent pedestrian and cyclist, but I think this actually really extends to many others in the city as well. There are a lot of things that San Mateans disagree on, but one thing I seem to hear unanimously across various divides in the city are complaints about speeding drivers and cars in our neighborhoods, which really does seem to have increased exponentially post-pandemic. So respectfully, despite the work staff has put in here, I really do believe that we need to rethink this and should be pursuing traffic calming efforts instead. Appreciate your time this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kelly Moran. Kelly, can you see if you can talk?
Hopefully. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Mayor Lee and council members, and also thank you to the clerk. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this item. My name is Kelly Moran. I live in Bay Meadows. I'm a former Public Works Commissioner and Planning Commissioner and have worked for decades on making our city a safer and better place to live and to accommodate transit-oriented development. I firmly agree with the prior speakers who I think have very well made the themes apparent here, which is that increasing speed limits increases the median speed, even if it doesn't increase the 85th percentile speed, thereby creating greater risk for everyone else using the road, even other drivers. Infrastructure is very important and effective in making changes to and reducing speed by sending those visual cues. And a great example of that is in San Francisco. If you compare two streets, Harrison Street and Folsom Street, Harrison Street has an 85th percentile speed of 47 miles an hour. Folsom Street, with the same design, was modified to include what they call a parking protected bike lane. They reduced the 85th percentile speed to 24 miles an hour. That's what we can do. That was a quick build. That was paint and some plastic bollards. Took that kind of difference. That's what San Mateo needs. So a new approach to safe streets is really needed in our community. I recognize that the Public Works Department has been working on this. I also recognize that our staff are overloaded in that department, have many competing demands. And because we're a relatively small city, our staff are generalists. They're required to know all kinds of different things. They can't be expert in any particular area. This area needs specialized expertise. There are a lot of practices that are being used by communities that are advanced in this area that are not being considered by our city staff. So as the council, I ask you to please direct staff to seek that expertise and bring it and make it available directly to you and not filter it through the staff who are just too overloaded to take this on as a priority. It's a desperate priority for our city, the lives of our residents at stake. And I cannot wait for the day where I don't have to cross an intersection, literally waving my hands above my head, which is what I've been having to do for the last several months here in San Mateo when I go for a walk. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Please immediately direct staff to stop working on this silly proposal and to go back to the drawing board on speed and everything else. Make our streets safer through infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our last speaker.
Thank you. With that, we'll close public comment and open it up to council for questions, please, not remarks. Who would like to start? Deputy Mayor Nash.
Thank you very much, Mayor Lee. Bethany, thank you very much for your presentation. I had a clarifying question. At the end, you talked about the timeline that you were recommending, and you talked about the final ordinances for the long-term plan being available in winter of 24. Is that winter of 23-24 or winter of 24-25? Thank you.
Through the chair. That would be 23, 24. So in about a year.
Thank you. Maybe to piggyback off that Deputy Mayor's last question, I have a few other hopefully clarifying questions, some of which are related to the timeline as well. So just to get back to what we're discussing, hopefully succinctly, it seems as though through maybe some of the work related to the local roadway safety plan and other initiatives that the city's been going through for the last couple of years, these 7 priority areas were identified. I guess actually one quick question is, are the traffic surveys typically staggered through the city? Do we typically review the whole city as we are currently planning to do by the end of the year? Or do we sometimes take it piece by piece?
They had previously been staggered, and it's not quite clear the reasoning for that staggering, or what order things were done in. So yeah, they had previously been staggered. And obviously the proposal this evening is to bring back one city ordinance that would remove that staggering in the future.
Okay. And so would you say it's fair to say that the idea behind what we're talking about today is, get these priority locations in compliance as soon as possible, and then review them along with the rest of the city streets with an interest in ultimately lowering as many speed limits as we can?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I guess I am concerned about some public comments that brought up an issue about the potential for raising the prevailing speed in a street that has its speed limit increased. You had gone into a little detail on some of the tools that I feel the city is hoping to use to lower these with the overall plan at the end of the year. One of them being, potentially rounding down twice as opposed to the once that we currently seem to have. But how, first of all, is it possible that if we raise these speed limits as suggested at these 7 priority locations, that the prevailing speeds will increase when a subsequent ETS occurs?
Yes, I think that's a possibility. However, in our discussions with our police department, there's a desire once these speed limits are implemented to go ahead and utilize their ability to enforce out there. And our goal really is to try to maintain the prevailing speeds at what they are, if not lower. So our ability to enforce out there, we're hoping will actually lower that prevailing speed such that we may actually be able to lower it in the future.
Okay. Would you say that staff is confident that when we do get to the subsequent survey of citywide, that with enforcement, this other tool available through AB 1938 that will take effect, we'll be able to get these 7 priority locations back at, to the current posted speed limits?
I think it's hard to say that we're confident in that right now. I do think that we will be making a substantial effort to try to, one, enforce the speeds with them being enforceable, but the identification and alignment with these other plans, I think is really what's going to help us get there. Because to your point, the preference is not necessarily to raise the speed limits if we have the ability to lower it, right? So that's absolutely our goal as well. And whether it be through enforcement in this shorter term effort or through our longer term efforts like the local roadway safety plan and the complete streets plan, the goal is to ultimately get to safer roadways and that has the potential for lower speeds.
And are there current plans to install any traffic calming measures on these priority locations this year?
So currently, let's see, to answer that specifically, for Poplar Avenue, for instance, we just implemented a quick build project that was a grant project, and that was a pedestrian safety project. So things like that. We also have a signal improvement to help not necessarily the roadway speeds, but intersection safety improvements at the Poplar Humboldt intersection. But not specifically speed cushions or other traffic calming devices at this point on these roadways.
Through the chair, if I may add, the complete streets approach, the reason why we introduced this difficult subject, this is a difficult study session, I think for all of us, is to really put it in the context of what a lot of the public has raised. How are we designing our roadways? And we need to reevaluate how that's being done. And that's part of the long-term effort, the complete streets plan, the local roadway safety plan. It's infrastructure, right? And with that will come a cost. As you are very much familiar with, we have master plans, we have proposals on improvements and infrastructure that is needed to ensure that drivers behave. That's a ways away, but we're all aligned on that, those as being effective tools and mechanisms, that built environment. What we can do right now is, if you take a look at the table that's in the AR in the presentation, drivers are exceeding our current limits. And the mechanisms that we have at hand, one of them being enforcement. So with respect to specific traffic calming measures, some of those segments just are not, it's difficult to put a speed cushion on J. Hart Clinton, for example. That might actually have unintended consequences. So I think it's about evaluating our segments, the tools that we have at hand right now, as we then work toward that complete streets approach and the make it safe. But we're not quite there yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I was going to ask you about 1938, and hopefully we've drained everything out of it we can. I thought it went into effect the 1st of January.
That's correct.
So are we able to use those devices now on these streets?
So the primary change that 1938 made was our allowance to utilize prior engineering and traffic surveys and retain those for the future. We've identified some challenges with the prior engineering and traffic surveys that we have that won't allow us to do so. And we also, that's for the handful of locations that we do have those. And for other locations that we've identified as our priority locations, we actually don't have engineering and traffic surveys for. So we wouldn't be able to utilize 1938 for that.
So I'll have some comments later, but this is now time for questions. So the other question I was going to ask you about, but one of my colleagues already asked, is on traffic calming. So there's no real traffic calming plan for these streets, but what have we got in other streets?
So we have a neighborhood traffic calming policy that allows for various types of traffic calming to be implemented. That policy currently stipulates that we should not be using it on our arterial and collector roadways. So these particular streets, there may be a challenge with making that recommendation. So we have, however, looked at the potential to revise this traffic calming policy that may open up that allowance for these arterial and collector roadways. But I think that would need to be looked at pretty closely. And there's well, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I understand. There's at least 2 of these streets that fit into the arterial. That's all I have for right now.
Thank you, Bethany, for your presentation tonight.
Couple questions. How did we identify these 7 locations for this study?
My colleagues here in the police department are actually here. They've identified, they were the ones that identified the 7 priority locations. And if one of you guys would mind providing a response to that. Sergeant Craig Collum is going to provide a response to that.
We came up with the 7 priorities based off of traffic complaints, collisions in the area, studying our collisions and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Since you're up, what is the opinion of the police department? Do you all feel that we have to raise speed limits in order to be able to enforce the speed limit? Or do you feel that there is a possibility if we retain speed limits that we should be able to just increase enforcement?
So unfortunately, without the traffic and engineering surveys, our hands are tied with enforcement like radar. And that's the most valuable tool for us to use in a city like San Mateo. We're not out on the highways, so there's other, we can't do bumper pacing. The streets aren't long enough. So our main tool for any sort of enforcement within city limits on our streets is radar. And without the traffic engineering surveys, we can't do any enforcement on these 7 streets.
Thank you. Appreciate it. The Safe Streets map. So Safe Streets measure was passed in 2021. And I believe that Poplar Street and Kehoe Street both are on that map. So how does that impact them? We're suggesting we're going to raise the speed limit and then months later just decrease it?
So the school zone speed limit resolution that was adopted will implement school zone speed limits when children are present. So it will be for a subset of the day, and following those times or preceding those times when children are present, it will go back to the default speed limit or the posted speed limit of 30 miles per hour if we make that recommendation.
So we're going to have a bigger variance during the school and non-school hours, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all the questions I have for now. Thank you.
I had a question for our traffic officers in terms of the capacity on better understanding our staffing capacity for traffic enforcement and what would it look like? What would an enforcement plan look like for these key areas? And how many person hours could we dedicate, say, to each of these locations in any given month?
Right now, we currently have 6 traffic officers assigned. Myself and another sergeant makes it 8 of us. We would definitely have time to dedicate. We haven't been able to break down the hours because the way call loads are and stuff. But during our free time, we hit hotspot areas, what we call them, regularly, and these would be added to them. Now that we would be able to do enforcement, they would be added to our hotspots and our complaint areas that we regularly target.
So, I mean, just for the sake of, ballparking it for, the public, what does any given hotspot have in terms of dedicated enforcement hours across the city? And this is for the public's education and just in terms of understanding, we have a total of 8 officers in a city of 105,000 residents and many hundreds of miles of streets.
They dedicate probably about 6 hours of their day on enforcement within the city. Some are hotspots, some are hotspot complaint areas. So it's probably about 4 to 6 hours of their day they're out there doing enforcement, including traffic investigations and other duties that we also do, calls for service and stuff. And our schedule right now, we currently have 4 officers Monday through Friday, and then we have 2 that cover shifts, which cover the weekends as well. So we have 7-day coverage.
Thank you so much. Are we ready to move on to comments?
So I imagine most people that are concerned about safety share my concern over this and raising speed limits. I'm not a stranger to this. I've followed it. I'm one of the people in our city that pushed for transit-oriented development. And I remember when we last went through this, at the very time we were proposing nearly 2,000 units of housing at the train station at Hayward Park, the state suggested through our traffic studies that we raise the speed limit on Concar to the Delaware on-ramp. It made no sense to me. It's a dual attitude towards speed and density of housing. And I don't think the two mix at any rate. We've got a situation where a large number of our residents now have electric cars that make virtually no noise. So people that are hearing impaired or people that are sight and hearing impaired are extremely at risk with raising these speed limits. J. Hart Clinton Drive at 50 miles an hour, even though it's not mentioned tonight as a school, there is a school right as you make that curve. It's a private Catholic school. And there's a lot of left-hand turns of parents in the morning. Actually, something I went through that was very beneficial is the Police Citizens Academy. And there was some discussion at this, and some of the police officers thought that if we have to raise the speed limit, that they have regular speed enforcement at the curve, because there's no way somebody that's going 50 or more is going to get slowed down to that 35 where it changes there on the curve. So that would be one way to handle it, but it still doesn't protect along J. Hart Clinton Drive. Quite frankly, I've lived in San Mateo for over 50 years, and I've never had a moving violation in California because I'm just a slow driver. Have I made mistakes? Yes, I've been lucky not to have been cited, but quite frankly, there's no reason in city streets to keep going faster and faster. So I just don't understand the Hillsdale Boulevard, those steep hills, and the map looks like you're taking it from 28th Street, but I know actually in the verbiage, it's 31st Street. That's a steep hill. When you get down to the bottom of it, you have the Hillsdale High School. Poplar between Delaware and Amplet. I don't know how anybody can get up to 25 miles an hour along there. It's heavily traveled. There's two stop signs, one at Grant, one at Amplet. It must be at some real off hours if people can retain. It certainly wouldn't be at peak hours. And I had one other comment on this. Yeah, on Norfolk between Kehoe and Roberta, that's actually one of our more busy Samtrans lines that connects with the downtown train station and Hillsdale train station. I take that, or did before the pandemic, fairly often to get home, and it was a pretty crowded bus. So there's a lot of stop and pickup. I think that, and there are kids that walk and bike along there that end up at the school on Kehoe near Roberta. So I would just have to say now that in my good conscience, even though we have a state dictum on this, I just can't vote to raise the speed limits. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Councilmember Hedges. Anyone else? And please keep in mind that we have another meeting at 7.
Thank you all. Be brief. I am frustrated by this study session. It feels as though the council is being requested to accept speed increases at key pain points around the city in which speeding is already a problem. At key pain points near schools, despite our interest in reducing speeds around them. And I am concerned about the possibility that if we increase the speed limits at these locations, that we, without traffic calming being a part of the overall plan this year, that we may have difficulty getting ourselves back to where we want to be. So I am personally interested in seeing what options are available to us to increase any traffic calming efforts in these and other areas in parallel with going ahead with this proposal in the interest of maintaining compliance throughout. I'm concerned about the long-term approach otherwise with these streets and more, because I do believe increasing the speed limit will increase risk if temporarily. As has been noted, enforcement is a tool, but it's not going to be available 24/7. So I guess I do think going forward, it would be great if we could approach upcoming surveys with a slow at first practice wherever possible, as has been suggested. Those are my comments at this time.
Councilmember, Deputy Mayor Nash.
Thank you, Mayor Lee. I guess I would like to support what my two colleagues have said and really put a focus on what could we do with Quick Build to get some things, interim things done to calm the traffic and maybe slow down this proposal and bring it back once we've had an understanding of what we could do quickly. So not rejecting it forever, but just saying, what can we do high priority in these areas to calm the traffic with very minimal effort before we go ahead and do this. So thank you.
Well, I concur with all my colleagues. I'm a father. I live on a busy street, Delaware Street, just a block from a school. I really am having a hard time getting behind the idea of raising speed limits so that we can do better enforcement. I echo everyone's sentiment about I'd like just to look for ways to slow streets more as opposed to raise speed limits. Thanks.
Thank you for being concise. I'll round it out and concur. In my view, the justification for enforcement alone is not enough of an upside. And I think that there's far too great a downside and that risks lives and actually sends us in the wrong direction of where we all agree we're trying to go, which is slower streets. My hope would be that we redirect staff resources to expedite implementation of our school zones and look at revising the policy for traffic calming and expedite our new ETS in a comprehensive way. I give full credit to our police department, which is out there every day, 7 days a week. And thank you for your efforts. This is the job of Public Works, is to bring these decisions and these forward to council so that we know what the trade-offs are. If we are in agreement that we are saying we accept continuation of status quo where enforcement is not an option on these high priority areas, then that's the decision that we make as policymakers. And we do so in service to a long-term vision, which I think can be more clearly executed given staff resources and focus. So that's my feedback. And I appreciate your work and your time and the education involved. With that, does anyone have any last closing thoughts? No? Okay. Do you have what you need from us? Thank you. All right, we will adjourn until 7 p.m.